Welcome to the Foundation. My name's Gaia. I'm the host and producer of this show Welcome to the Foundation. And before we begin, I have a bit of a request from you. As you know, this show is hosted out of CHSR FM in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and we are currently looking to get some opinions from our viewers. So, if possible, we would love for you to take a few minutes to fill out the 2023 CHSR Listener Survey so that we can get to know our audiences better and make sure we're doing a good job. And also so you can enter a draw for $50 worth of downtown dollars if you're based in Fredericton. So, if you want to fill out the survey and help us produce better shows and better content for you, please visit chsrfm.ca/survey, spelt SURVEY. Anyways, thank you again for listening and being a friend to CHSR, and remember to go to chsrfm.ca/survey. The survey ends on July 24th. The contest entry part is optional as well, and it's a maximum of one survey and one entry per person. Anyways, now we're going to get to the show and the usual content warning that starts us off. Warning: the following content is primarily horror-based using online stories. This episode will contain descriptions of blood, gore, violence, otherworldly horror, and nasties of the sort. Unlike previous episodes as well, today's stories are going to be written from the first-person or third-person perspective rather than our usual scientific format, so they'll come across a lot more personal and might be a bit more unsettling than you're used to. As well, one of the stories, specifically De Capo al Fine, which is a story about a little girl, will contain a brief mention of child abuse for about 30 seconds. It's very early into the story, but when that story begins, if you don't want to hear it, mute it for about the first 2 or 3 minutes if you want to avoid that section. For these reasons, viewer discretion is highly advised. Welcome to the Foundation, new recruit. For the past few weeks, I have focused on telling you all about many different SCPs, going so far as to show you some of our best and brightest and even our funniest in some cases. You might remember the Dimension Hopper as one of the more recent ones, or you might remember the Plague Doctor or the Flesh That Hates as a few of our best lessons. Now, it feels like I do this every few weeks, but I want to change things up for your next few lessons. But don't worry, we're not leaving the plan I set out at first, at least, not much. Originally, the plan was to break our lessons up into 4 phases. 4 regular lessons, which would focus on the more popular, or I guess internally popular, files on hand. Then 4 unique lessons, where I would pick special files that were particularly suited to your education. I would then spend 4 episodes working with you on solving a problem that I've been stuck on for longer than I'm willing to admit, and then I would end off with 4 of our tales. Back then, I might have called it a wild card or a bit of a bonus, but the goal was to tell you stories from the perspective of people who encountered SCPs or other aspects of the Foundation, maybe from recordings or read out to you myself. Well, we finished the regular lessons, that much is clear. And we did do 3 of the unique lessons, and I feel like we've covered all of the material I wanted to get through. The most important one there was Mother Earth, but they all had value. So now, we have the option of covering the problem that I've been facing, or the tales. So, how did I pick what we should do next? Well, the problem was simple. The problem I was facing was trying to find the real SCP-001. And, well, I did try to make a lesson based on solving this problem, and it wasn't good teaching material. In fact, I'm worried the 05 will have my head or bring me all the way down to D class if I actually attempt to solve it, and, well, that's not worth it. And my fate would be a whole lot worse if I try to teach it to you. So, instead, it's time to go into the tales I mentioned. Now, you might be wondering, what even is a tale? Well, most often, A tale represents a file, a story, or a history discovered or produced by the Foundation that has been deemed anomalous or about an anomaly that we have or that we don't anymore. But unlike the major files that we have been reading up until this point, these often lack the detail to make it into one of our reports. You see, the main SCP files, the ones that are given a number and sometimes a name, involve an active anomalous object that we can directly attempt to secure, contain, and to protect the world from. These tales don't necessarily present that. They present, instead, a history, a story, a discussion on an anomalous object that we can't personally address. That's only one side of the story, though. On the other side, they can also often be first-hand accounts of interactions with various SCPs that we do have on file. Think of it as an attempt for the Foundation to catalog and understand all of the data that we have, though sometimes we get data that we need that doesn't fit into a numbered SCP. Anyways, I think I've given you enough background. At this point, if you need to know more, you'll learn it easier from listening to a tale than listening to my instructions. So, let's begin. Welcome to the document recovered from the Marianas Trench. Presented to us, cataloged, and stored by Dr. Gears, a name that you should be familiar with right now. Now, before we begin, you might be wondering, how am I going to present a tale to you? My usual dry readings of these many files isn't going to cut it for a well-written tale. Well, I'll still read them out, but understand that I might have to present a little. Before my time as a site director, I got a good deal of training in how to have a stage voice, so I hope that helps. Let's begin. I need to write this down because I forget things sometimes, and I think what I heard today was important. Not to me. The time for me or almost anyone else alive on Earth today to make a difference has passed, but someone, somewhere, might be able to make something of this, or at least find it helpful or something. Once I'm done, I'm gonna seal it up in a pipe, coat it in wax, and chuck it into the ravine. Maybe someday someone will read this and try to put things together, if they're even allowed to. I'd love to start from the beginning, but I'm honestly not sure when the world started to end. Could have been years and years before the final bits, or it could have been all at once. Everything was so grim. What with warmer air, cooler seas, too little gas, and too many people, things could have been unraveling for ages before things bubbled up to the public eye. What I and other remembered most was the Disney magic sank. It was then, I think, that most people started to think that things might be worse than they seemed. The Disney Magic was a big cruise ship, one of those liner jobs that tools around islands and stuff. One day, the news was all screaming about how it suddenly just went down when it was trying to port. The weird thing about it was how there was no video of it for quite a long time. Some still pictures of it floating fine, but none of it actually going down. Then, somehow, a tape showed up and the news started playing it. I have to imagine they didn't review it first. The ship was puffing along, strong and fast, with little boats bobbing around it, looking like every vacation lover's dream when, suddenly, it stopped. I mean, stopped, just a dead halt, like it had just slammed into a mountain or something. You could see people go lurching forward all over the deck, and a bunch of junk fell off the sides, a real mess. It's all still for a few seconds, and then suddenly there's this foaming behind the ship. Most people assumed it was the engine trying to fire up again, and then the arm came. I'm not actually sure if it was an arm, but it was some kind of limb, and it must have been 100 feet long at least. It reached up along the side of the boat and just ripped it open. I mean, unzipped it like a coat, and you could see all the people inside screaming and running. It was awful. Then you saw something lurch up, a big spiny shape pushing against the gap, shoving in, and then there was an explosion on its back, and the camera whipped up to show a couple of jets whizzing by, and then it ended. I remember just sitting there, stunned, looking at the TV and barely noticing the president coming on to declare a state of emergency. I think it was 2 or 3 days later when the TV went under full government control, but it may have been a week, I'm not sure. The internet got clamped later, but soon all you could hear, read, or see was "Remain calm. Everything is under control." The oddest thing was that life didn't really change much for a while. Bills still came, still had to go to work, go to school, all of it. Just a lot more scared faces and a lot more weird talk. Pretty soon, we were getting told that whole towns were being evacuated, that there was a plague or a riot or a terrorist bomb or some other nightmare. My brother down south said they got moved because of a huge wildfire. The weird thing was, he said, that the fire moved oddly, seemed to shoot right for gas or brush, and didn't travel evenly. That after a while, he swore he saw what looked like a 20-foot tall man of fire walking and eating everything. The call got dropped right after he said that, and I haven't talked to him since. So things got worse, little by little. People kept being moved, and there was no real way to communicate with each other anymore that was actually reliable, so it was hard to say just how bad things were. Still, word of mouth was still going strong, and it was creepy. Crazy shit, really. Stuff about zombies in the north, killing frenzies in the east, a place near the ocean where the ground was alive and eating people, a cult screaming about the second coming and killing people to buy off God. I must admit, I started pulling more and more away from people just to get some ignorant peace of mind. Looking back, I probably saved my life. Anyways, finally, one day, I woke up and there was blood on my window. It was outside and I could hear some insane shit going down. Screaming, clanking, gunshots, and a smell like burning wires. I hid. I'm not afraid to admit it. I left my fellow man to rot and hid inside for almost a week. Long after the noise stopped, honestly. After the 5th day, the electricity and gas gave out, along with the running water. When I finally got hard up for supplies, not too long after, I poked my nose out and saw that the whole west side of the world was gone. Now, I don't know for sure if it's actually gone, but there's a cliff that starts 30 feet to the west of my house, and I can't see the bottom of it. I also can't see the other side of this ravine, so for all intents and purposes, that part of the world is gone for me. The suburb I was in looked like a war zone. Blood and broken stuff everywhere. Houses carved up and no bodies. There were no bodies, which I still think was weird. I scrounged up some food and stuff from some houses and then just went back home. I've been doing this for a while now. I'm not sure how long, to be honest. Might have been years and years, or just a few months. It's hard to say. Sometimes the sun just sticks in one spot for what feels like days. Other times the clouds roll in and you can't see 2 feet. There's things around, too. I run at the first noise, but I think they're man-sized and they seem to like metal. Other little things scramble around in the rubble sometimes, so I try to keep clear. One time, a thing that looked like a pill bug the size of a cat crawled out, looked at me and screamed, "Stop!" in perfect English. I hid inside for days after that, not gonna lie. There are also these big blimp-like things that float around sometimes. They have little bug legs on the other side, and they kind of look like maggots, but with eyes all over them. They eat everything when they land, but most of the time they just stay high up. One of these had just passed when I found a hurt guy. He was all ripped up and looked like one of those SWAT team guys you'd see on TV sometimes, but his combat suit thing was all ripped to hell. I dragged him back home, and then we talked. He said he had been hunting the blimp thing, but had gotten attacked. He wouldn't say by what, but he looked like he was on his last legs, to be honest. I fed him some canned beans and some water, and he seemed to come around a little. Asked me who I was and if I was alright and all that. He seemed kind of shocked when I said he was the first person I'd seen since the rest of the world vanished. He told me it wasn't gone, just relocated, but wouldn't say what that meant, so I helped him heal up and kept asking who he was, but he wouldn't say. Finally, after a while and some begging, he said screw it, that his orders were probably no good anymore anyways, and he told me. He said he worked for a foundation or something, that they were like a combination jail and research center. He said that he was one of the agents who went around trying to find strange stuff and keep it from hurting people, sounded like a Men in Black kind of guy. I said he was doing hell of a job so far, and he laughed pretty hard at that one. He said something had happened, that a bunch of these things had gotten loose all at the same time and caused this foundation place to lose control. He said it became a GH-0 dead greenhouse scenario. So I asked him what that meant, and he looked at me for a while before just going on. He said that's what they call a situation where everybody on Earth dies, but the Earth itself is still okay and can possibly support life still. I asked him what did it matter if everyone's dead, and he smiled strangely. I asked him if anyone else on Earth was still alive, and he said yes, but carefully spread out and well contained. After that, I just sort of sat and digested things for a bit, and the man started stretching and checking his cuts. He was starting to pull on his boots when I asked what happens now. He said they have to reboot things, said they have the technology to recreate almost anything, and that making people is apparently pretty easy. Said that they would clean out and contain things, rebuild the broken cities and repopulate them. It would take a long, long time, but he said they would eventually get things back to the way they were before. He even said they could recreate memories and stuff. I just sat there, kinda stunned, and watched him as he just kept going along, getting dressed like this was no big deal. I told him he was nuts, that there was no way people could just forget, that this could all just be swept away. He stopped, looked at me, smiled, and then said, "Why not? It's been done before." I don't know if that man was crazy or not, but he sounded or acted as if he was sane, even if what he said wasn't. As he was leaving, he said something about putting my house underwater. Please, don't let them brush me away. Don't let them hide us. Try and find more. I know there's got to be more people who tried to leave something behind. If you're reading this, don't let the world die in vain.
Is titled
Remember Us
Until Death.
Please.
Now this is about an SCP that we covered quite a long time ago. In your second lesson, we covered an SCP titled The Old Man, which was a dimensional SCP known for going through walls and transporting people to a pocket dimension where it could melt their flesh and consume it like this black liquid. Well, I'm not sure how we got our hands on this story, but the story now is about him, one of your favorites. I should probably note, before we begin, that this story is provided to us by one of our researchers named psul. Imagine it like Paul, but with an S instead of the A. Now, as one final note, this story contains dialogue between people within it, and we don't have a recording of them speaking per se. So instead of worrying about that, I will present the voices in the same way a school teacher might have when they read stories to you a long time ago. Allow us to begin. She didn't hear it. Not at first. At this time of night, the labs were deserted. The whole of Site 120 was practically empty. Corridors dim and silent, offices shut, experimental apparatus crouched in shadowy chambers. There was no anomalies contained on site, so the only people left in the compound were a couple of security staff and a 63-year-old researcher hunched over a bench full of notes and textbooks, a single desk lamp bright against the lab's enveloping darkness. She had always been wrapped up in her work, her colleagues said. There was no one to go home to. She had been with the Foundation for many years, many late nights like this, engrossed in the calculations and correlations spread out in front of her. And so she didn't hear the noise, not when it started. A soft, crackling hiss from the far corner of the lab, a sound like wet leaves in a fire, like whispers from a dried-up throat, just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't until she breathed in the smell, faint but thick with rot, that she started from her work, turned, and noticed the sound. The researcher pulled herself down from her lab stool, that familiar stiffness in her hips an unwelcome reminder of the hours and years she had been in the lab. Absently, she pushed her glasses back up and peered across the darkened room. The noise was still there. A few seconds of listening failed to resolve it into anything readily explainable. She had taken 4 steps across the lab when the lamp behind her blinked out. Swallowed in darkness, she froze. The noise had gone. Her breathing had grown rapid and shallow, and she forced 2 deeper breaths before taking out her phone and switching on the torch, or flashlight. After a moment's hesitation, she turned back to the workbench to see what had happened to the light. As the torch beam swung, the first thing she registered was that there was something different on her pile of work. Something foreign, dark, wet, bloody. Her brain caught up. It was a human kidney, complete with ureter and a tangle of blood vessels. It glistened in the torchlight, a crimson stain seeping into the paper beneath it. Her throat grew tight. The noise started again. It was thicker, somehow. Moist. She looked over her shoulder, indecisive. Her brain was blank, reacting without thinking. 1,000 other choices pushed out by the sheer impossibility of that noise. This mangled organ in front of her. Stay here or go there? Almost before she realized, she was walking cautiously across the shadowed room towards this sound in the source. The torch lit up the back wall of the lab, a corner behind the mass spectrometer. A black smear had spread across it, the paint and plaster bubbling and flaking in a slow roil. The whispering sizzle was louder, and the air was heavy with an oily stink of decay. Close to, she could see the surface of the wall had softened, sagging in wet bulges. She hesitated. The hand shot out of the wall faster than thought. Its fingers were broad and gray, sticky with black mucus and grabbing her forearm. Instantly, her lab coat started to melt, and as she yanked her arm away, the sleeve tore off, disintegrating. The finger snatched at her again, and she dropped her phone. As she stumbled backwards, the torch shone up from the floor, lighting the figure that pushed its way through the mottled, fleshy wall. It looked like an old man, decrepit and rotten. It was naked, its skin slick and shiny as pitch. Its flesh was withered and decomposing, with missing toes and misshapen feet. A distended gut protruded obscenely from beneath a narrow chest, arms spread wide in a mockery of greeting. Above a ruined throat, she saw a too-wide mouth locked in a rictus grin, and eyes. Oh God, those eyes! The thing emerging from the wall before her looked like a man, but its eyes were gray and flat as a shark's. The researcher took another 2 steps back, reaching behind her for something, anything solid to hold. Her breath caught in her throat. The old man stood still, dripping black foulness onto the floor as the tiles began liquefying beneath him. Her phone sank beneath the surface, and the torch flickered out. In darkness, she ran. She was panting by the time she reached the lab doors, ruining her age. The extra weight she carried, every exercise session she postponed. As she turned to close the doors behind you, she could see the hideous figure pacing deliberately across the room. Something about its lack of hurry unnerved her deeply. She forced herself to keep running down the corridor, calling for the night guard, hoping he was close. Frank! Frank! After the second turn, she saw him, halfway from the guard station, gun in hand. What's wrong? Frank jogged up to her as she doubled over, spots in her vision. Frank, thank God it's... Her chest was heaving. She could hardly speak. How could she describe what she had just seen? Slow down, eh? Take a second to... Frank trailed off. As she looked up to see his gaze fixed on the end of the dim corridor, she knew what he had seen. The old man walked towards them, trailing a viscid ooze. When Frank trained the torch on him, his eyes shone avid and empty, 20 feet from them now. Hey, stop, now! Frank shouted. I will shoot you! The grinning cadaver kept coming. 15 feet. 12. Frank fired. 3 shots. 2 to the chest. The old man stopped, gradually crumpling forward. The researcher let out a breath. The glistening corpse sank into the floor, swallowed by the slime it had generated. She felt sick with shock. What the fuck was that? Frank started towards the blackened floor, but she held his sleeve. Wait, it's... I think it's some kind of acid. Her voice was hushed. Her throat felt raw. We need to call someone. Frank pulled out his radio, but paused, his thumb over the button. Not until I know what to report. Suddenly, she didn't want him to move away. Not even a few feet. Please, she said, stepping into Frank's path. There's nothing like this on the database. There's nothing. We need an MTF. Aye, don't tell me to do my job, said Frank, sounding piqued. First I need to... No! She was gripping his sleeves now. Frank, I know dimensional anomalies, and this was from one. I saw it step out of the wall. Frank tried to shrug her off, but pushed too hard. She fell awkwardly, a wrench of pain from her ankle. Tears sprung to her eyes, and Frank was instantly regretful. Oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean... He cut off as a glob of black mucus landed on his radio, setting it fizzing. Frank dropped it like he had been stung and glanced upward. The next drop landed in his right eye. The researcher scrambled backwards as Frank roared and clutched his face. She could hear the hiss as the corrosion ate at his eye socket from the inside. Then she saw that grinning face emerge from the dark patch on the ceiling, and the old man dropped onto Frank's back. One hand slid into the muscles of his shoulder like it was dough, and Frank's roar became a scream. As he crashed into the wall of the corridor, she saw the other hand sink into Frank's throat and tear, and the scream was abruptly cut off. Frank started to collapse into the wall as it darkened around him. The last thing she saw was those eyes, locked on hers as they sank back into the blackness. Empty eyes, but somehow full of promise. Her heart pounded. The taste of bile was in her throat. She tried to stand, but she was lightheaded and her ankle was throbbing. She had to run. She had to run. Every second not running was death. Dragging herself up on a cabinet, she tried to think, eyes flicking between the ruined radio and the puckered bruises on the wall and the floor. Run? Where? Guard's office, the alarm. She forced herself forward, gasping at the pain in her foot. Her lungs burned. Every shadow in the half-lit hallway loomed like a threat. Not much further now. Don't look behind. Each step was a battle, trying to move faster, trying to stop her leg from buckling. Forward momentum was the only thing keeping her upright. She rounded the last corner, saw the guard station at the end of the hall. It looked empty. She could make it. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself to a final run, closing the final yards and crashing through the guard room doors. Her first step inside sank shin deep into the frothing muck that used to be the floor. She fell and her hands were caught too, skin burning as they were sucked deeper into the ground. Looking up, she could see the console with the alarm button just out of reach, and she wailed in sick despair. It was the last sound she made before the world was consumed by night. Death did not come. She was submerged in a lake of pitch, but somehow the researcher could still breathe, could still think. Was she falling? She couldn't tell. All feeling had vanished, her skin no longer stinging, although the blood still pounded in her ankle. She stayed there, suspended for minutes, unsure of the passing of time, of what this all meant. Then, the gloom lightened, blurred and resolved into a tiled floor. The gray light showed her a room that she didn't recognize, but which was somehow familiar. Dust, dead leaves, and scraps of metal were strewn across the floor, and one of the walls had buckled in on itself. She pulled herself over to the door and looked into a dilapidated hallway, mold and rust covering the ceiling, and the floor contorted like a writhing snake. There were no lights, but the hall was just lit by a gray-green glow, a sickly aura undulating sluggishly across every surface. She'd been right. It was a dimensional anomaly, probably controlled by that thing. The researcher felt desperate. Probably it had made this place or had lived here for years, so it would know every inch. But if she had fallen into it, that meant there was a way out. She just had to keep moving. She would find it. She limped into the corridor, clambering over collapsed furniture and wiping plastered dust from her hands. The familiarity of the place snatched at her thoughts, but she tried to ignore them. Keep going forward. Look for an exit. Don't think about what might be behind you. Don't think about Frank. Don't think about that grin, and don't think about those eyes. A metallic buzzing grew louder, and she realized it had been there since she arrived in this place. She tried to move faster. A gust of wind blew around her, fed it. Her heart was racing again. This place was familiar, but how? She needed to stop, just for a moment. She grabbed at a door handle, relief flooding her when it opened. She walked into her old apartment and spun in confusion. This was impossible. The disarray of the halls was gone. Everything here was in its proper place, but nothing about this place was proper. She had left this apartment 20 years ago. The building had been torn down. The researcher spread across the room, the need to rest forgotten. Everything here was hers. Her books, her furniture. The window showed the same view, an incongruously bright day. How? She raced to the bedroom, her bed made and everything neatly put away. She opened the closet and the corpses fell out onto her. It was a mountain of decomposing limbs and organs, limp and slick. They slithered down under her, and the weight of the pile trailing Gore. She retched at the deep, foul smell, flailing wildly to pull herself free. A bloated hand pawed at her legs as it fell, and she felt something slippery and soft underneath her foot as she stood. This assemblage would have taken dozens of bodies, she thought, still gagging. As it slumped further, it exposed a face that she recognized. Frank. A deep hole where his eye had been, and his neck was torn open with black jelly dripping from it. Her eyes scanned the line of his body and saw his leg twisted viciously upwards, exposed bone protruding where the foot had been ripped off. She was trying to hold in a scream where she heard movement from the back of the closet. Without thinking, she ran. Behind her, the sounds of limbs pulling themselves clear of the corroded wall. She bolted for the door to her apartment, ankles screaming at her. She could feel the old man enter the room, only a few steps back. The metallic buzz constricted around her as she emerged. Staggering down the hallway, realization overwhelmed her. This wasn't some old hospital or school. Her apartment had given her the answer. It was twisted and corrupted, but this was Site 120. She couldn't think about why that was or what it meant right now. Was that she might know a way out. She took another left turn, skidding on the wet floor and crashing her head on the opposite wall. Her ears rang. The footsteps behind her were louder, closer. She dragged herself onwards, her breath a whimper from the pain in her foot. One more corridor and she should be back to the guard room. She hoped like hell that the dimensional parallels held up. The footsteps drew closer. She could hear the drip of ichor. Her vision grew dark. The hall telescoped in front of her, and a hand clutched at her back, her lab coat melting to tatters. The guard room was just ahead. She was exhausted. She couldn't make it. The floor beneath her started to bubble. With a yell, she crashed through the guard room doors once again, pushing through the oily puddle behind them and surfacing in the real Site-120. The ghoul was still behind her. She fell hard on the console and slammed down her hand on the alarm. Klaxons blared, the emergency light flashed. She turned, pushing herself as far as she could into the corner of the console, but the old man had halted in the middle of the room. He was staring at the light. She heard a new noise, like a deep growl. Suddenly, she realized that the corpse before her had a lump of new flesh in its throat, bloody and ragged. Frank's throat, she realized as her stomach dropped. She looked again at the old man, seeing its misshapen carcass patched and scarred. The old man was still transfixed by the light. Its growl built in intensity. It made a sound that sounded like it was attempting to say red. Her mouth went dry. The thing looked at her with its dead eyes. "Anna," it said, like a sigh. "Anna." She made no sound. Her mind was screaming. The old man took a step towards her. Another step. 5 years, 11 months, 21 days, and 25 more years after that. Falling apart, rebuilding itself, rebuilding its world for her. It held up its left hand. She could see the mark where the ring had been. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The old man reached towards her, tenderly holding her cheek, her skin puckered and liquefied, flesh dripping from her face. It brought its grinning mouth to hers and kissed her, and her teeth became hot wax, fusing and corroding. She screamed then. The old man pressed his kiss harder into her open mouth, his swollen gray tongue melting hers and filling her throat with molten muscle and caustic jelly. The last thing she felt was the weight of two of them, sinking into the floor, locked in a final, burning embrace. And now, after that story, which I must say is probably the darkest story I have ever presented on this lesson series, I think it's time for something to cool down a little bit. The next file is titled UIU Orientation. It's one of the many files produced here in the Foundation of lessons for people of interest who might be attempting to join or have interacted with anomalies in such a way that they are more useful to the Foundation with their knowledge than amnesticized. This one is centered around the FBI's Unusual Incidents Unit. And, well, I'll let the file do its own talking. And for those of you who want to know who wrote it, this has been documented and presented to us by Kingreaper. Allow me to attempt to do a good voice for this. For those of you listening, I recommend you sit up, present your table like it was a school desk, and prepare.
Welcome to the FBI's second least popular division, the Unusual Incidents Unit. Most of you are probably here as a punishment because somebody wants you out of their hair. Any of you here because you told your supporters the truth and they didn't believe it? Just one. Well then, I'm gonna need to make a demonstration. You see, the UIU is a joke, but not for the reasons you guys think. I'm sure most of you will recognize this gun that I'm holding as a Desert Eagle. It's loaded with .50 bullets, so 7 rounds in the magazine. Let's count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I could keep going, but I'll hand the magazine around so you can see that I'm not using a sleight of hand. So, if what we're investigating is actually real, why are we a joke? Because we are way out of our depth. You guys aren't trained for the sort of stuff we're meant to be investigating. Of course, you do get really good bereavement benefits. Pop quiz, how many rounds are there in that magazine? Nope, the guy I found it on thought it was limitless too. It holds 1,296 rounds. He ran out while shooting at me. Now for the terminology. We deal in carts and cans. A cart is a confirmed artifact, an object that doesn't belong within this world. And a can is a confirmed anomaly, an event or area that involves something impossible. A can man is a person who's anomalous. These tend to be particularly dangerous, and you'll probably find someone else is there looking for them. We're not the only ones dealing with this stuff. When you're out on an investigation, keep your eyes out for the other interested parties. First up are the suits. Men in suits, sunglasses, the works, your stereotypical spooks. Men in black. If you get a chance, keep an eye on them. They're bastards, completely untrustworthy, but if they give you an order, you follow it. They work for the government, apparently, and they outrank you, and they outrank me. Next up are the fireworks, militia groups, highly trained and sometimes armed with carts. We figure there's more than one. We've seen them fighting each other. They come in and take or destroy whatever it is they're after. Then they leave, and we have to cover it up. Don't try and interfere without backup, and be aware that they are much better equipped than you are. They're dangerous, ruthless, and vicious. But at least they're honest. If they give you an order, follow it. If you don't, they'll kill you. Next up are the cart shoppers, Marshall, Carter, and Dark. They're an auction house and a gentleman's club. Their customers are extremely rich and tend to have rather disturbing tastes. Official policy is to raid any known cart dealers, but you should be very careful around MC and D. Their security forces don't want to make a scene, so wait for backup before going in, and you should be relatively safe. If they give you an order, well, decide for yourselves, assuming you have free will at the time. Next up is the Can Collection. They call themselves the Serpent's Hand. They often interfere with the actions of other groups, generally to free or protect can men. They are happy to use artifacts and have very little interest in secrecy. They understand anomalies better than most because most of them seem to be anomalies. Do not confront them in public. You won't win, and the suits will be annoyed about having to clean up your mess. If they give you an order, though, consider following it. They can probably set you on fire with their mind. And finally, the guys we actually get on with, the skippers. You'll know if they're there. You'll see something labeled soap and care products, superior customer produce, sudden career possibilities, or security for corporate profiteers. They're not trying to hide from us, just the public. The skippers are well trained, know what they're doing, and they're helpful. Their aim seems to be similar to ours. Find anomalies quietly and get them under control and out of the public eye. If they're there, then the problem's probably out of your league, but you can go introduce yourself if you like. If they ask you for help, well, they'll make sure your family are looked after if you die, and in addition to the standard bereavement package from us. If you receive a call starting with, "Hey Skipper," it means there's something they can't be bothered dealing with. It's almost certainly a minor artifact. Those things help us keep our funding, so make sure to take skipper calls seriously. If a skipper gives you an order, follow it, because while they probably won't kill you, the anomaly will. I once took orders from a pizza delivery guy. Didn't even realize he was from Spicy Crust Pizzeria until it was all over. And that is why we're a joke. Hope this helped.
And now, I think it's time for your final story for today. I know I've kept this pretty intense on you up until this point. I've been loud and I've been quiet. I've told you some funny stories of how the FBI interacts with us. I've also told you about, well, the end of the world, buried in Marianas Trench. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about reality-altering SCPs. So, this tale, and I have no clue this time how we got our hands on this at all, because it contains data that I am shocked that we have, is titled De Capo alla Fine. It is presented to us by DrClef, which, a little fun fact, DrClef has written many of these reports. Seems to be a specialty. Let us begin. On her 5th birthday, Sugiros Stefansdottir, or Sugiros, looked down at the cake that her foster mother had baked for her and wished that her real parents had never died. She blinked her eyes and found herself in a strange home with a man and a woman who she had never met before in her life. The man was shouting at the woman, who wept and hugged herself tightly. There was a bruise on her cheek, and she was rocking back and forth like a child as the man heaped abuses upon her, ranting and raving angrily. On her 6th birthday, Sugiros whimpered and covered her ears as she heard her mother scream, and she wished that she had never made that wish she made last year. She blinked her eyes again and found herself back in the foster home. It was her 5th birthday again, and her foster mother was waiting for her to blow out the candles. So she did. This time, she wished for a pony instead. On her 2nd 6th birthday, Sugiros hugged her favorite stuffed pony and wished that she had 10,000 friends. She blinked and suddenly realized just how many people 10,000 really was. She wondered how she was going to find a cake big enough to feed them all. Then she did have a cake big enough to feed all her friends, but there were angry people outside her house trying to break down the walls and get a piece of her cake, because it was the only cake in the world at this point and everyone else was hungry. She blinked again and found herself back in her foster home, looking down at the small, normal cake and surrounded by her usual 6 so-called friends who really weren't. She blew out the candles a 2nd time and this time decided to wish for a fairy princess dress-up set. On her 7th birthday, Sugiros wore her favorite princess tiara as she blew out the candles. Her favorite stuffed pony sat on top of her dresser, in a place of honor, but she had outgrown carrying a stuffed animal everywhere she went. She didn't know what to wish for this time, so she didn't. It was then that she saw the old man sitting at the foot of the table, where no one should have been. He had thinning gray hair, and he smiled as he got to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "Come with me," he said. "I think you're ready for your first lesson now." She took his hand, and he took her away from the foster home and into a different world. On her 8th birthday, Sugiros learned about the ways. There are people between places, the teacher explained. They are how you get from places that are to places that could have been. When he said that, Sugiros realized exactly what he had meant. She brushed her hand over the manhole in the middle of the Los Angeles intersection and climbed through into a place filled with books and learning. "Happy birthday," the teacher said. "Now it's time that you get your library card." On her 9th birthday, Sugiros met the Fox. Everyone always spoke of the Fox in all capitals, capital T and capital F. She wasn't sure how or why this was, or even how anyone could even convey capitals in normal speech, but they did, and I, as the reader, didn't. The Fox was a tall, beautiful woman with eyes like dagger and teeth like knives. She smiled at Sugiros and licked her lips with a cruel, carnal hunger. Sugiros wasn't afraid, though. No one could harm her while they were at the library. The docents wouldn't let them. That wasn't true everywhere, though. Later, Sugiros heard that the Fox had been shot by some people while she was trying to skin and eat people who, for some reason, liked to dress up as animals. Some people were very sad when they heard this happened. You see, Miss Midnight explained patiently, even though she wasn't a very nice person, she was the last Fox. It's always sad when something disappears from this world. On her 10th birthday, Sugiros learned about mistakes. She'd been looking up at the sky and wondered what it would look like if it were pink instead of blue, and then it was. In a panic, she tried to change it back to blue, but she could never get the color quite right. It was either too dark or too light, or too green or too purple, or too bright or too dark. She was in tears by the time that the teacher set things right again. She expected to get scolded for nearly messing up the sky forever, but the teacher was sympathetic. "We all do things like that sometimes," he explained. "The important thing is to learn how to set things right again." Some men in black suits came a few days later. They talked to the teacher at length, and the teacher seemed upset by those visits and muttered to himself a lot, but in the end, things worked out. On her 11th birthday, Sugiros met the ukulele man. He came to the library with a briefcase and some papers, and although everyone else in the library didn't seem to like him, they left him alone. He sat down with her in one of the side rooms, and he asked many questions and did many strange things, like asking her to pick up a pencil that had been knocked off the table, or asking her very suddenly how many friends she had. Sugiros followed her teacher's advice and told the truth every time. She also picked up the pencil herself because the teacher had taught her that one should always try to be as ordinary as possible whenever possible, because that caused less trouble for other people. The ukulele man seemed pleased by this. He had a talk with the teacher afterwards and told her that she was a Phase 2 transitioning into 3 with little chance of a 4. Whatever that meant. He also claimed that she had been designated Response Level 1, and he patted her head and told her happy birthday. The teacher seemed very relieved once the ukulele man had left and gave her a hug, and then they had cake with all her friends. On her 12th birthday, Sugiros kissed a boy. On her 13th birthday, Sugiros decided to try being a boy and kissing a girl. On his 14th birthday, Stefan decided that he preferred being a girl, all things considered. On her 15th birthday, Sugiros started to wonder if this sex thing people talked about was really worth it. Shortly after her 16th birthday, Sugiros and the very nice boy she kissed 4 years ago finally figured out this whole sex thing. By her 17th birthday, Sugiros had grown a bit bored of this sex thing and decided to try all of the other deadly sins in order to see if they were really as fun as people seem to think. She started with pride. Just before her 18th birthday, Sugiros had tried absolutely every single sin known to humanity, and a few that had not yet been discovered, and had grown bored of all of them. She decided to try the virtues next, starting with charity. By the time she was 19, every virtue had grown boring for her, especially since it turned out to be a lot harder than expected. She could have waved her hand and done it easily, but her teacher's lessons had driven home to her that something like this often caused more problems for the people who weren't like her than it was worth. She decided to give up both virtue and vice and decided to try wisdom instead. At around 20 years of age, Sugiros had learned everything that was possible to know, so she started on things that were impossible. She figured out the impossible shortly before she turned 21. She toasted the beginnings of her research into things that were not with her first drink as a legal adult. She was still wrestling with the things that were not when she turned 22, and 23, and 25, and 50, and 70, and 900, and 20,000, and 4 billion, and finally, when time itself had ceased to hold meaning for her and a year was about as significant to her as the blink of an eye. It was only as the last proton in the universe decayed and nothing existed anymore but an endless expanse of nothingness that Sugiros finally reached the end of her searching and felt at peace. It was both the next instant and an endless number of eternities later that Sugiros got bored. What was the point of knowing everything and nothing if there was nothing to do with any of it anymore? She searched around the infinite nothingness until she found a place that was a little less nothing than everything else. Here, she decided, she would start creating new everythings and new nothings to experience and learn about. She clapped her non-existent hands and brought reality back into existence. Time, which had long since stood still like a stopped clock, began once more. Symmetry was broken, dividing what had been pure balance into what is and what is not for a second, third, millionth, infinitive time. She closed her metaphorical eyes and opened them after a trillion aeons, plus 1 year, to find herself being pulled from warmth and darkness into a world of cold light. And that was how Sugiros spent her first birthday.
And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. I hope you found the previous files to be informative and to properly, at least somewhat, prepare you for life at the Foundation. I will see you next week at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in the Fredericton region, on www.chsrfm.ca online, or on your favorite podcast platform for your next lesson.
And now, as we close out, I would like to give a thanks to those in real life who contributed to the production of this episode. In particular, I would like to thank, firstly, Kevin MacLeod, who produced the music that you found in the background of this episode. You can find the background tracks I used and more at incomptech.com, all under the Creative Commons with Attribution 4 license. I would also like to thank the previously mentioned SCP authors, whose content was provided under the Creative Commons with Attribution 3.0 license on the SCP Wiki. And with that, have a good one.